distinct pleasure of being moderator for this panel this evening. I started doing this moderating gig in 2015. I was kind of horrified when I did my first one because I was following in the footsteps of the master moderator, Des Kennedy. And I have to say, it is a bit of an intimidating role because you're on the stage with three people who are undoubtedly smarter than you are. They've certainly written stuff way better than you've ever written, right? And they've probably been at dozens of festivals and have done this kind of stuff before, so I'm definitely at a disadvantage. But it's a thrill for me to be on the stage with Peggy Harring, Jónína, Kirton, and Michael Christie. And I'll go into a little gory detail about each of them in just a few moments. But first of all, we got a couple of door prizes, and I think we need to dispense with that. So please dig into your pockets.
Should have brought my fan.
You only need to keep track of the last three numbers, okay? So if any of you are numerically deficient, oh yeah, you can pick the first one.
You're Vanna.
Pick the first one. Okay. Okay, the first one is for a $20 gift certificate from the Earth Club Factory Guest House, just up the way. Everyone looking at the numbers? 074. Excellent.
That's my friend.
Collect it. No, you can stay in your seat. Thank you very much. And the second one is for a bookstore in Comox called Blue Heron Books for $50.
Don't touch.
089. Good. Great. Now, the second thing I want to do is for 80 of us who had dinner in the back hall tonight, we had a fantastic meal, and I want to acknowledge Evan Penner and his gang for providing a wonderful meal. And the third thing, which is a great surprise to the person I'm going to mention, a certain person in this audience, beloved of our committee, has her birthday today. And it's Helen Mason. So in the country that where Helen and I both came from, you got bumps on your birthday. So the bumps will be... Is that something like hypothetical? We'll provide the bumps later on. So let me tell you how we're going to do this evening. We've obviously got three very talented authors who are going to, at some point in the evening, read excerpts from their three books. Anna, Like Thunder, by Peggy Harring, Standing in a River of Time, by Jónína Kirton, and Greenwood, by Michael Christie. Now, I don't know about you, but I was totally blown away by these three writers in their solo sessions. They were absolutely amazing. But on the other hand, that's what we expect of our writers, right? The thing I wanted to remind these authors about, and there may be some others in the audience, you can win your Gillers, you can win your Governor Generals, but what you've got now is that you are Denman Island alumni. So put that on your resume. Okay, so I'm going to just introduce them from the other way around, just because so often men get, you know, not paid enough attention.
Exactly.
Okay, next year I'll change it the other way. All right? Okay, so this is Michael's second time on Denman Island. He was just a youngster when he came in 2016 to read from his first novel, If I Fall, If I Die. This year, of course, he's bringing Greenwood, that amazing novel, intergenerational novel of family and trees. He lives with his wife and fellow writer, Cedar Bowers, and their 2 children on Galliano Island and in Victoria. Jónína comes from Vancouver. She's the author of 3 books of poetry, An Honest Woman, Page as Bone, Ink as Blood, and Standing in a River of Time, her most recent one. She, as you know from her solo session, draws on her Metis Icelandic heritage for her poetry and essays. And Peggy lives in Victoria and has brought her second novel to us, Anna Like Thunder. Her first novel, published in 2014, was This Innocent Corner. She has a background in journalism and international development. Now, one of the interesting things that we on the committee have to do in advance of each festival is try to mix and match authors and try to figure out how we can make interesting panel discussions of this kind. Ideally, we want to find a common theme if we can. And for this panel, we found it was pretty easy. Hence the title, What's Past is Prologue. Michael's book is a book that goes from 2038 all the way back to 2008. No, 1908.
The year of your birth, Stuart.
One of the things I found really humiliating is that the authors very frequently correct me on my mistakes. So clearly it's a book which has history in it. Peggy's book is about, or based on, an actual shipwreck of a Russian ship that happened in 1808. So once again, history is a very dominant feature. And Jónína's books certainly draw on her background. She said in her solo session yesterday, my ancestors are pushing on me. And I thought that was a wonderful way to describe how the past drives some of her work. So when we looked at all these books, it made us think it would be really interesting to get these 3 people together, 2 novelists, 1 poet, and to look at how the past, how history, informs, inspires, and motivates their writing. And that's the basis of why we call this What's Past is Prologue. As I'm sure the former English teachers in the audience know, What's Past is Prologue comes from The Tempest. It's not going to be a discussion about Shakespeare tonight, okay? It's going to be these authors. So look, let's start off by just asking each of you if you could just give us your initial impressions of just the answer to that question. How does the past have an impact on your writing? And we'll start off with Michael, and I can assure you that the next question we're going to start off with Kate.
Thank you, Stuart. And I don't know. I mean, I've thought about this. I've sort of stared at the subject of this discussion for some months now, and you know, all I can say is that this book spans 130 years, and it's about generational relationships. It's about intergenerational trauma. It's about intergenerational inheritance. It's about the climate. It's about land. So I don't think there's a word in this book, and it's 530 pages, that isn't founded upon the idea of what's come before it. And trees as a metaphor really cement that in the novel. So.
Interesting.
That's too short.
I can't be the guy who speaks the longest, Stuart.
It's not a good
You want me to keep going? Okay. Well, Shakespeare, hell of a writer. No, I mean, well, okay. Well, the book, it's I don't want to repeat myself from my solo session, but the book is structured like the rings of a tree. It begins in the near future, travels back through time to the very beginning of the family, and then comes back out through time to the near future again. This, one of the most wondrous things about trees, I think, and there are many, but perhaps the greatest is that their life, the scale of their lives, the fact that they can live thousands of years in some cases, gives scale to ours and dwarfs ours. And I think it's probably something that we'll find in all of our work tonight, that idea that literature can give us a window into the incredible influence of the past upon the present. And the tininess of our lives. I'm a person who believes in constantly reminding myself how short life truly is, and how precious it is. And so trees are kind of my best way of reminding myself of that. Is that long enough?
Good. Jónína, your turn.
Oh, wow. I've been thinking ever since you first sent the email about that statement, the past is prologue, and praying, because I like to pray when I'm going to write or speak or do anything. And just today I heard an answer, but it's short. They're always short. Anyway, it was just I'll expand on it. But what came to me was that the past is never past. And so, you know, history repeats itself over and over again, and in some ways the past is never past, and we're always sort of living it. But thinking about time and how time moves, my title is Standing in a River of Time, and I don't acknowledge this in the book because I could not check it with the elder. He had passed away, but I once heard him say, and I don't think it's fair to quote him if he can't tell me whether it's accurate, but I would recall what he said was that the time is like a river, and that the past is in front of you, and the future is behind you, and that this past is sort of going away from you. So you can see the past, you can't see the future. And I just, when he said that, like I literally went, wow, we think about time all the wrong way, you know, like the future's in front of you, no. So that is very much a theme of the book, is looking at the past, and looking at the past not to feel sorry for myself, not to get you to hear all my sad stories, but more about how we can learn from reflecting on the past, so that the past isn't always, never past. So if we want to break patterns, if we want to learn how to make changes, we have to be able to reflect on the past. And also to not hide the past, because shame has been a big part of my history. So the effects of intergenerational trauma were not Indigenous, even though my father was very visibly Indigenous, and so were his mother. And there was a lot of hiding of all sorts of things, and a lot of it was hid around respectability politics. That's why I have my lipstick on. I'm still participating in that to some extent, but we were really taught to, make sure that we present well. And it was kind of like, if it looks good, it's all good. It doesn't matter what's really happening. Nobody needs to know. So I really liked to bring forward these stories. Nobody in my family is happy that I'm doing this, other than my little niece, but most of the people are very upset with the fact that I'm telling stories. Wow. And I have to think about this because I do care, but at the same time, how do you take your story apart from someone else's part in your story? You cannot. So I had to make a decision to tell it. And it's about the past.
And that's the pushing, right? You mentioned this term of your ancestors are pushing you.
Oh, they push on me. I tell you, they were very loud at one point when I was first starting to write. And and when I say that, I don't know how to describe what that means. It doesn't mean I'm hearing a voice, although I hear something. It's very hard to describe, and many of you, I'm sure, have experienced it yourself. It's not like a voice, but yet you know. And I think they wanted me to uncover the stories, and for whatever reason, I was the designated person in my family to do that. And I think if I had not done that, I don't think I'd be here. I don't know if that makes sense, but I don't think I'd be here right now if I had not been willing to do that. Yeah.
That's good. You spoke about twice as long as Mike. Okay, Peggy, see if you can do better. Even
Not much going. I really appreciated what Michael and Jónína said, and then there were several things both of you said that made me think I have so much to say, to pick up on this. But I do think that the value of the past illuminating the present is what really draws me to it. Sometimes I feel like we live in a confounding world, and it's by going back and seeing the patterns, whether it's at an individual level or a societal level or a community, that's how I learn, how I figure out where I am, where we are today. So in the case of Anna Like Thunder, that book is set in 1808, and for those of you who weren't at my presentation yesterday, I found out about this story at a National Historic Site where there was a map of shipwrecks. And there was a little tag on this map, and it said, in 1808, the St. Nikolai's shipwrecked, and there was a Russian woman on board, and she may have been the first European woman on the Olympic Peninsula. And that twigged for me because my mom is Russian, and whenever I see Russian stories, particularly involving women, my ears are just like, okay, I have to find out about this. I have to find out about this. And so much of how my brothers and I were raised is part of is reflected in the book in many different ways. So I drew both on the historical record and on, my upbringing to put that story together. Was that long enough?
No, but would you like to read something from Anna to illustrate the point about the past and history?
Oh, sure, I can do that. Also, Stuart, can we talk later, because I was really interested in this notion of the passage of time as well, that Jónína and Michael both raised, but the speed or the rhythm of the passage of time.
Sure.
I'm going to talk about that.
Sure, absolutely.
But let me read first, okay? So this is a very brief passage from the novel, and what I'm going to read, let me see. The ship has wrecked. The Russians are ashore, and they have decided that they're going to walk from where the shipwreck is about 120 kilometers down the coast in November 1808. And they're carrying all the things that they will need over the next few days. They're going 120 kilometers down the coast because they're going to meet another Russian ship, they're hoping, and they will get rescued. Okay, so my main character, Anna, is the one speaking here. And she is part of this lineup of Russians walking through the forest, okay? I hope that sets the scene. The trees thin out a little and allow the silver light to reach us. The forest floor here is covered with crisp leaves, yellow, orange, and brown, which rustle as we walk through them. The trees are neither as tall nor as imposing as the conifers. A few have silvery bark that reminds me of the birch forests I visited often with my parents. My father liked to wander in the forest. He'd see something, an unusual fork in a branch, or an abandoned nest, or freshly dug earth that suggested an animal might have had a den nearby. And he'd wander off the path. My mother preferred to stay on the trails and insisted always that I stay with her. I knew this girl, she began one day, when my father had disappeared on one of his diversions. She lived in a certain village, not far, not near, not high, not low. She was walking in a forest just like this when she came across a necklace lying on the path. Where did it come from? I asked. I don't know, she said dismissively and continued. The necklace was extraordinarily beautiful, so beautiful that she forgot the incantation. What incantation? I will tell you. I am going to teach it to you, but you must promise me that you will never forget it. She waited. Well, do you promise? Warily, I said, I promise. I hope my father was too far away to hear. Good, my mother said. Now repeat what I say. Earth, earth, close the door. One necklace, nothing more. Earth, earth, I command one necklace in my hand. When I was able to recite the whole thing by myself, it was easy. She continued. Without the incantation, she took that necklace and she put it in a box with her other jewelry. That night, when she was asleep, a voice woke her up. Give me back what is mine, that voice said. Who was it? I asked. Voices have to come from somebody. Oh, you sound like your father. Listen, I will tell you, she said. There was a man beside her bed, and it was his voice. She was terrified, and so she said yes, she would give it back. When she opened her box to get it, the necklace was gone. The man took it? I don't know who took it. This is not a real story. This is not possible. It is a real story. It happened to my friend, she said. Don't you want to know how it turned out? I nodded. Well, the man was very angry. He said, you've taken what belongs to me, now I will take you. Well, I was old enough to know what she meant, but I still didn't believe it. He told her never to tell anybody, or she would die. So every night it was the same thing. And I know it sounds crazy, but my friend said he would show up as a flying serpent. He'd transform into a man and then take my friend as though she was his wife. Until finally one day, after a long time, a short time, she couldn't take it anymore and she told me. And what happened? Anya, she died the very next day. My mother wrapped her arm around me and pulled me close. That's what the spirits do if you're not careful when you go into the woods, she whispered.
Juicy.
So where did you get that story from? Where did you get that?
My mother and grandmother would tell me stories like that. There was always a message, there was always a little bit of a moral. It was a way of explaining something that they wanted you to do. But that particular story was not told to me either by my mother or my grandmother, but the incantation part would be part of the kinds of stories that they would tell me. And they always knew, like it always happened to somebody that they knew. So it was always presented to me as my cousin's sister's friend, that kind of thing.
Good.
But I feel like my life was so much richer for for those stories. Like I feel like it really formed me as a child to hear those stories and to be able to believe in things that were not because let's face it, 1960s growing up in rural Ontario, it's a very realistic kind of place. So my mother and my grandmother, they brought into my world another kind of universe that I wasn't, really aware of. And I'm so grateful that it's almost like they opened my eyes to see something that I could not see physically.
you've actually begun to answer one of the questions I was going to ask you later on, which is basically, when did all three of you begin to think about the past? I mean, you know, were you 5 years old, were you 15 years old, were you 30 years old, whatever. I mean, I think about questions that I wished I had asked my mother, you know, about her past and her history. And I mean, I used to find that I wasn't terribly interested in my parents' early lives until it was too late to find that out. And haven't we all had that kind of experience? So I guess I'd like maybe to follow up that point that you made, is when did you first begin to think about the past and history and how that was of interest to you?
Would one of you like to start? I've talked a lot.
Yeah.
That is such an interesting question. I remember being a teenager and trying to ask my grandmother, were we indigenous? We said, were we native? And she literally shook, and I asked her sister, and the same thing. They would just literally shake, vibrate, and say, no, we're French. And I was really struck by that as a child. So I wasn't allowed access to that part of the past, but at 16 I did do an assignment for school, and I'm so grateful that I did. So I got to ask my grandmother about her life, which she told me that she had been widowed at, I forget what age, but my fourth child was coming out 2 days after my grandfather died, who was also Métis. And here she is, 4 children, a Métis woman in Manitoba. So I was really glad that I got to ask her that. I wish I could have asked my father more. I tried to ask more. But I didn't start thinking about my personal past until I was in recovery, and you do step 4 and 5, and you start looking at all the stuff you did. It's not fun, but very healing.
Okay, could you say a little bit more about that? I'm not familiar with step 4 and 5.
In recovery, there's 12 steps, and so step 4 is you write out all the things that, and there's different ways to do it, but you write out all the things that have sort of hurt you could say, resentments that you have, big pivotal events in your life that you look at under a certain light, trying to keep your side of the sidewalk clean. So not about blaming someone else, but understanding your part in things. Yeah, it's quite a process, and it can take days.
It sounds like almost everybody ought to go through that.
That's what we always say. But we shouldn't say that out loud.
You just did.
I'm always doing that.
Michael, what about you? How old were you when you began to wonder about the past?
I'm going to tell 2 brief stories. One is one of my earliest memories. I got for Christmas a Chewbacca figure, like a Star Wars action figure of Chewbacca. Chewbacca was my most favorite character in Star Wars. I was thrilled. I'd asked for it for a long time. And I was out front of my house playing with this action figure near a sewer grate. And I remember taking, this is like my most vivid early memory, taking this action figure and just putting it closer and closer to the sewer grate, and unaccidentally just dropping it down the hole for no reason. And then after, thinking like, my God, what have I done? And then just having my mind just blown by the idea that I couldn't get it back, that it couldn't come back, that I couldn't travel back in time. And it was almost, this may sound weird, but it was almost like my first experience with death. This idea that something could be done and it couldn't be reversed. And that past was gone. And I was devastated. I was very upset. And so, the second story is, as I was writing this book, or just prior to the writing of the book and during, I lost both of my parents to cancer very fast and very kind of surprisingly. And so I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I was processing all kinds of grief, and I was also processing this new awareness that, as you said, Stuart, I didn't think much about who came before me, my family, my own place in this generational chain. But after something like that happens, you do. And we have 2 young sons, and so all of these ideas came very forcefully upon me at that time. And I think part of the writing of this novel was the processing of that new sense of like, oh my God, I actually am in this river, as Jónína described it, of time, and I have a place within it, and I'm traveling along this path, and sometimes things can go away and they don't come back.
Yes.
I'm sure other people have had that experience. Maybe not with Chewbacca, but... Jónína, how about reading an excerpt from
Okay.
Standing in the River?
Okay, so this is, of course, I have to go in a sort of a bit of a different direction than I did with the other readings. So this is from the chapter called Rebirth. We all come from somewhere. There might be some people in the room who are familiar with a practice called rebirthing. I did a fair amount of it at one time in my life, and so this is looking at that, but also wondering if my son is my mother. So, the first time I met you, I was lying on the couch of VJ, a healer specializing in a practice called rebirthing. For months now, she's been taking me back to my own birth. Sometimes we do this in water to make it easier for me to enter the spaces where I began. Together we visit my mother's womb, a time before words. In those moments, all that exists is water and the drumbeat of my mother's heart. Every visit, VJ asks me to recall my descent down the birth control. I got Roe versus Wade on the brain. Oh my goodness. Every visit, VJ asks me to recall my descent down the birth canal. Some days I resist the best way I know how. I escape into my mind, the wordless place of meditation. When she notices I have done this, she's asked me to change my position, to get on the floor on all fours. I'm to breathe deeply, pump my body up and down. I don't like this. I prefer the drifting. Then one day, while floating on her couch, there you were, touching my face as a blind person reads Braille. My face a map you followed. Your hands I now know. I could feel your spirit, the lightness of you, as you introduced yourself to me. And there's a couple of poems that go with this one. The first one's called Umbilical, and they have sections, so 1, 2, 1. A navel string connecting us, delivering sustenance, until shock of light awakens me. Doctors, nurses, masks, surround sound, words delivered. It's a girl. 2. Liquid born, I linger on the edge of what I know about my mother, the way she held me within her womb. I have wondered, did she want me? I do recall her saying the best days of my life were the days my children were born. Tied to us, she could not leave. 3. Firstborn, the only girl, I held potential. Egg-filled promises of love delivered faulty fetuses until one managed to hold on. 4. My son, I wanted a water birth for you, no shock of light or masked faces. I wanted to welcome you, but once you arrived, I could not hold on to you. Arms, knees shaking, I vibrated loss, mourned the absence of water, the crooked path down a canal too narrow. I give thanks that you made it, son. Now that you are here and I am alone, ghosts linger, nibble on your toes, whisper in my ear, reminding me of my mother's words, my mother's love. She too is glad you are here. And there's a second poem that goes with it called Samsara, and it's got sections as well, so 1. Mother, I have lost my place. It is dark here, Mother. Without you, the earth is damp, made thin by loss. I am cold, in need of shelter. 2. I have a son now, Mother. He swims within me. I must build a fire, light the way for your return. 3. He cautions me in the kitchen when I'm angry. His small finger pointing, he says, I used to be your mother. 4. I hear a cry. He has touched a hot iron, his lips pouting. He has that why would that thing want to hurt me look. I scoop him up, rush to the rocking chair where I cradle him while he cries, then pauses just once to say, your mother never did this, did she? How does he know this? Was he a toddler remembering another life? I don't know, but he was always reminding me that he is not just a child, that the wheel turns.
How much of that do you feel came from direct stories that you heard from your ancestors? And to what extent did you kind of create your own perception of those incidents?
Well, I am a recovering New Ager, so some of it came from that.
Is there a 12-step for that?
Well, maybe. And I don't know. I mean, I really do wonder at times if he is my mother, and certainly with him saying those types of things, I have to wonder. So, you know, did she come back to take care of me? Because I know she was quite concerned about me when she left. She asked my aunt to take care of me, which she did not do, which she has apologized for this year. How many years later? 38 years later? Yeah. In her 80s, she said, I'm sorry, your mother wanted me to care for you, and I didn't. Yeah. So I feel like my mother's with me, and I have since the moment she left, that she talks.
Yeah.
She's walking with me.
You're fortunate to be able to feel that way. I would
Yeah.
think. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Michael, how about an excerpt from
Yep.
England?
I'm going to, it's a difficult book to read from because it's so big and it's heavy to hold up. No, I'm just kidding. No, because there's many characters, there's many generations, many storylines that all kind of interweave and interconnect. But I'm going to be reading a short section from the perspective of a character named Liam Greenwood, who is living in the year 2008. He is a carpenter who does reclaimed wood projects for expensive homes along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Grew up in this area, but he lives in his van and kind of works installing wood in these very, very expensive homes, and he works alone. So the thing that's happened is that he's fallen during his section, landed on his back on his phone, and he's lost the use of his legs. And this scene, which I recognize as quite tragic, comes sort of at the very end of his story when he is kind of looking back on his life and making amends in his mind with the folks in his life who he's perhaps wronged. Some characters he'll mention. Mina is his partner who he's estranged from, and they've had a child whose name is Jacinda Greenwood. And so that's the title of this chapter is Jacinda Greenwood. On the day of her birth, he's working with his phone set to silent, a particulate mask strapped over his face, and hearing protection clamped tight over his ears. He's sanding a slab of expensive Douglas fir that he'll install in some Brooklyn yoga studio or some corporate office in Manhattan, the drone of his orbital sander nearly erasing the oddly similar drone of guilt in his head. A week later, Liam still hasn't replied to Mina's initial text, sent to announce their child's existence when he receives another of her texts, this one telling him that she selected a name, Jacinda, after a kind girl Mina once knew in school. She also surprises Liam by revealing that she's given their child Greenwood as a surname. Mina says she has a few male cousins already carrying on the Bhattacharya name, and she found it too tragic and unfair that Liam's surname should die off completely. Even when performing a musical piece, Liam thinks, Mina always hated endings. Despite his efforts to banish his daughter's very existence from his mind through constant toil and a strict regimen of deliberate forgetting, Mina often texts him pictures documenting Jacinda's early years. A little black-haired girl grabbing at her feet or smearing paint or chasing pigeons, images that Liam always views with half-averted eyes, the way one might glance at an eclipse. He keeps the photos on his phone, though he never prints them out. And now that his phone has been smashed, these photos are gone. She must be 3 by now, which means she's already lived 1,000 days without him. 1,000 days he could have come home with his hands full of splinters, but not too many to prevent him from picking her up and swinging her high enough to brush the ceiling. 1,000 mornings his daughter had woken, and he hadn't been there to witness those thick lashes open like wildflowers. 1,000 nights he had failed to read her a story and then watch them close once more. Liam remembers George Nakashima, it's a carpenter that Liam studied, once writing about how in a traditional Japanese family, a paulownia tree is planted immediately after the birth of a daughter. It's a species that grows rapidly, and by the time the girl has matured and is ready to leave home, the tree is likewise ready to be harvested for its wood. The handsome, fine-grained boards that it yields are shaped into an ornate chest, inside which the grown girl will store her kimono. For this reason, the paulownia tree is known as the Empress tree, and the most shameful mistake he's made in all his life, Liam now admits bitterly, is that he never planted one for Jacinda. He pulls a 3-inch wood screw from the pocket of his Carhartts and begins to scratch some letters into the concrete floor beside him. When was the last time he'd written anything that wasn't with his thumbs on his phone, something that wasn't spelling assisted? He takes great care to get the words down right and arranged in the correct order. To reduce the chance of making a mistake, he keeps it brief. Everything I own to Jacinda Greenwood. With love, your father. He takes his time, retracing the words again and again with the screw's tip to carve them deep and ensure their legibility. He wishes everything meant more than it does. His meager cash savings, a plot of worthless land in Saskatchewan, a stack of poetry records, his arsenal of tools, and his work van, all of which must total something in the neighborhood of 50 grand. In one of Mina's most recent texts, she mentioned that Jacinda is bright and can already identify letters and animals, and that she loves trees most of all. So perhaps she'll use his money for her education, which is no empress tree, but it's something. I'm not ready to die, he thinks first, then whispers aloud, then shouts, the words reverberating in the sparsely decorated room without a scrap of carpet to dampen them. The sound makes him feel minuscule, no bigger than no more consequential than the screw clutched in his fist. And after that, a series of doors begin to close in his head. Never will he know the stories that Temple and his mother whispered about on the porch. Never will he taste the bitterness of oxycodone or watch fresh wood shavings fly from a lathe or smell a rhubarb pie baking. Never will he ride with his mother in her van or walk with her through the tall trees. Never will he hear Mina play her viola while she's wearing pajamas in the kitchen. Never will he feel his daughter's warmth against his chest, and never will the story be told in full. Time, Liam has learned, is not an arrow. Neither is it a road. It goes in no particular direction. It simply accumulates in the body, in the world, like wood does, layer upon layer, light then dark, each one dependent on the last. Each year impossible without the one preceding it. Each triumph and disaster written forever in its structure. His own life, he can admit now, will never be clear, will never be unblemished, will never be reclaimed, because it is impossible to ungrow what is already grown, to undo what is already done. Still, people trust the things he's built, and there is something to that. It's not enough, but it's what he'll take with him. Through the ensuing dim and delirious hours, Liam consoles himself with hazy imaginings of people sitting with their coffees at his counters to talk and complain about those they love. People leaning against his bars to drink beer after beer, confiding desperately into one another's ears. And a little black-haired girl with thick lashes sitting at one of his tables, eating a piece of carrot cake as his mother looks on, as her mother looks on. The girl's muddy shoes swing beneath her as she talks about trees.
I did tell them all that I wanted happy readings.
It was about time. That quote about time, I couldn't resist. Yeah.
One of the things in reading 3 books that we're talking about tonight, it's pretty clear that all of you did a lot of research, particularly the 2 novels, but also, Jónína, you were doing research in terms of talking to your ancestors, getting stories, looking at photograph albums, and family memoirs, and so on. I guess I'd like to ask you all if you could tell us a little bit about what surprised you or shocked you about the research that you did. I mean, some of it would probably be pretty routine. You had to know exactly when a certain event occurred and so on, but there must have been some things that surprised you or made you laugh or shocked you. And I guess I'd like to ask you all if you could have a crack at responding to that question. And inevitably, we will start off with...
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Thank you for that question. I'm really enjoying this so much, you guys. Thank you so much. And I feel like I keep thinking of these things that just keep coming up over and over again. But the time, the passage of time, the non-linearity of time, and also the natural world and how that seems to maybe perhaps embody it or something like that, right? But you know, we've got water, we've got wood, we've got trees and forests, you know? So there are actually some really cool connecting threads. And I hope we have time to talk about that. Now, in terms of my own research, I feel like there's 2 pieces of research that I needed to do for this book. So one is the historical record, and so for that, I found eventually, it took me a couple of years, but I found a book where the record existed, and the record in the case of this consists of a first-person account of a Russian fur trader who was aboard the ship that wrecked and who was rescued a year and a half later. And the second record is of a Qayqayt elder who would not have been alive at that time, but this was his family's oral tradition. And that was recorded in the early 1900s, so it would have been fairly fresh. It would have been perhaps the generation before him. And he told that story to a US government official who wrote it down and recorded it. The Russian fur trader also told his story to a third party, a Navy captain, and that person also wrote it down. So when you read the record, you have to read it with a grain of salt. There's a lot in it that is, you know, you have to read it carefully, just carefully and slowly. Some parts of it you think, yeah, that's legit, but some parts of it you think, wow, they would never use that word, or how could they have possibly have known that? So Stuart, in terms of what surprised me or shocked me, I don't know, surprise and shock is not the right word, but I was aware of where the story came from, and then how I needed to interpret it a little bit. And I don't know how many people were, again, at my talk, but I did some consultations with the Macaws, the Qayqayts, and the whole river people, and there were things in the record that they also flagged for me, where they said, no, that does not seem like something he would say or do. And so they guided me through that, a little bit of that interpretation. And then, I don't know if I have too much else to say about it, but the record is one piece of it. There's so much missing from the record, and as a fiction writer, I was really excited about that. There's real opportunity to create things. And if any of you want to ask me later, I'll tell you what's made up about Anna, because there's not a lot known about her, and so I did have to make up stuff, but I did not make it up just lightheartedly or haphazardly. I really thought about who she might have been and tried to give her characteristics and behaviors that I thought would be appropriate to her. Yeah, like I said, the record is an interesting place to start, but I feel like you really have to go much further than that if you're going to get anywhere.
Jónína, I mean, clearly some things shocked you, looking back.
Oh, well, geez. Not really necessarily to the book, but informed the book later was doing my genealogy search. So there's my grandmother saying, no, 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 we're French, and my dad saying, no, no, and but my mom saying, your father hates being native, so somebody knew, and it was talked about somewhere. But it's such an unimportant thing, it's so far back, it doesn't matter. And so I go do my genealogy search, and it's not like that at all. It's, Métis marrying Métis for many, many generations, and before that, from 1680 coming over, there's many different indigenous nations. There's nations that are folded into my family. But what surprised me for the book specifically was when I started writing the chapter called Displaced, It's Always About the Land. I hadn't really planned to write about that really, but then I started thinking, how do I be more fair to my parents? So let's be honest, they weren't like, some things you'll think, oh my God, they were terrible parents, but in many ways they were good parents. And so I wanted to be fair to them. But writing that, I also started folding in some of the history that I learned and why we had to live in Charleswood in Winnipeg, which was a place that mystified me because I had lived in Portage Prairie, I lived in Thunder Bay and Goose Bay, Labrador, and Churchill and all sorts of places, and why were we moving into Charleswood, which was an upper middle class part of town, when we had historically been living in not upper middle class parts of town. But my father was doing better. But I realized that there must have been a draw there for him in some way because Charleswood was a place that Métis had lived, and it was a passage that they had used right on the Assiniboine River. And further to that, my great-great-aunt had planted trees in Winnipeg. So I started finding out, and my dad had said, I think we're related to the Goods. I'm not sure, which was a rare admission for him. And sure enough, yes, Marianne Good planted one of the trees on Wolseley Avenue in Winnipeg and many, many years ago. So some of those things were a big surprise. So how could it be that I live where I live and I didn't know that? Never mind that I didn't know my own personal history of my family, but I didn't know many things. Roostertown, I didn't know that I'm in Grant Park Plaza, and that was where Roostertown used to be, where probably either my ancestors or their friends lived and visited. And how did I know not know I'm walking on this ground and this is where we used to live, perhaps? How did I not know that?
Yeah.
I know that when I'm out somewhere that's not got cement. But Grant Park Plaza, I didn't feel it.
Anything surprised you, Michael, in your research?
Yes, I mean, I will say that I have a very complex relationship with research. I am very suspicious of my ability to procrastinate while doing it, and to sort of use it as busy work that keeps me from the actual difficult process of writing. There's just one more detail I need to pull on the lumber industry, and so
The rabbit hole.
exactly, it's a rabbit hole for sure. And particularly with this book, which takes place in 5 different time periods, and so each time period required its own bit of research or sort of discrete set of research. And I treated it almost more like a method actor. And this was a funny time for Cedar and I, when we have a little writing cabin, sort of a 10 by 10 writing cabin, and we each sort of go out there and do our work and escape the bedlam of life with 2 children. And so I would go out and, when I was in the 1974 section of the book, I was listening to the music at the time, I was putting up photos of the time, and, almost kind of living in that era while I was writing each section. And so, I discovered all kinds of stuff during the process, much of it that didn't make it in. I will tell you one quick story. I've never been too interested in my own family genealogy for whatever reason, but after my parents passed, my aunt did a deep dive into our family history, pulled my great-grandfather's birth certificate and looked at it and said, "What is this?" Because it said his mother was not a Christie, and he was born to a woman named Euphemia Baxter in Edinburgh, Scotland, and his mother, and Euphemia Baxter was written as a domestic servant. So they put it together that this child had been taken or adopted to Canada, because all my family came from Thunder Bay. And that, so essentially, this name, Christie, this word that has attached itself to my brother and I and our family, really, we really weren't Christies, if there is such a thing. So it really kind of threw this whole generational thing, and the idea of a name, and a sort of a patriarchal name system, into just, it felt pretty irrelevant. And kind of ridiculous, this word. And I will say that I took that name, Euphemia Baxter, and put it into the novel to kind of honor her.
I love that.
Stuart, I feel like, history is like this kind of like this well, but it's sort of bottomless, right?
Yeah.
And you're never going to get to the bottom of everything. But I also feel like there's this kind of like little bit of magic that happens in terms of you get what you need when you're ready for it. And so I agree with Michael, there's an age which you don't care too much about your family genealogy. You might even be ashamed of it. I know a little bit about that. I just roll my eyes about my parents. But my parents are both still alive, and they're in their 80s. And my best times with them now are spent with piles of family photos or movies. I just feel like it's so wonderful for them. They get so happy, and I feel so satisfied. I could sit with them for days now and listen to them. Oh yeah, that was your cousin's daughters, or that, and go back generations of photos that when I was a kid, I would have been like, ugh. Yeah, this is so boring. Not bored now.
Yeah.
So it comes to you, right? When you need it, when you're ready for it.
Yeah.
There used to be a sense that history was settled. You knew certain things, you knew certain facts. I remember growing up as a little boy in England, right after the Second World War, and my narrative was that England had won the Second World War with a little bit of help from the Yankees, right? And then as I studied history, I discovered that, the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians had a lot to do with winning the Second World War. And then I went to Russia 25 years ago and started visiting Russia. And suddenly I discovered that it was actually the Soviet Union who won the Second World War and had defeated the Nazi regime. And it suddenly hit home to me that revision, it was a totally different perspective of history depending on where you came from. I mean, it's not a brilliant observation to make, but I think in whether it's Canadian history or personal history, history is never settled. You know, I mean, Faulkner's great quote, which I think Mike almost used word for word, the past is never dead, it's not even past. And
You got that from me.
I thought you were much younger.
That's right.
Yeah. So, would you guys like any other comments to each other or observations about the past, or would you like to open it up to the floor and get people to raise points or ask questions? What do you think?
How do you feel about the passage of time? Let me ask.
Oh, yeah.
The passage of time,
Yeah, I mean, you addressed it at the very end of that reading, right?
it's painful. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
the non-linearity of it,
Okay,
let's say.
okay.
Yes.
Didn't mean to-
And Jónína too, I think. You also addressed it, like, you know, like in terms of your reading and where your son is involved, like your mother, the circularity of it, you know.
Yeah, I'm really still on the fence about whether we are reborn or whether I'm remembering my ancestors' memory, blood memory. Because I do have memories of other lives, what feel like memories. I don't know if they're mine or are they my ancestors, and somehow I can experience them in some way. They're in my body. I don't do time well. So I don't keep track of time very well. I don't know what day it is sometimes. I don't know what time it is. I don't know how long an hour is. So if you know, I have to use my timer. I literally have to set a timer all the time to get myself on track. So I don't, but as an older person, it sucks. The passage of time, it begins to suck. It begins to like, oh, wow, you know, I hope I have more time, but I hope it's gonna be good time. Like I don't wanna, so there's this whole negotiation that's going on right now within myself of, okay, yeah, I wanna live a lot longer, but not if I can't do some things, like, you know. So that's what I'm thinking about time lately.
Yeah, time, I mean, it's, as an artist, I think it was Walter Murch, the film editor, called making a film sculpting in time. And I often feel that way when I'm writing is, you know, there is an implicit, if I say, you know, someone dropped the book and then someone picked it up, you know, that's time. You're creating time just with language. And I find that fascinating. And if you had asked me when I was younger, you know, I would have said, oh, time is linear. Are you nuts? Like that is, you know, that's not an idea that I, you know, would even entertain. But the older I get, there's a weird thing that happens with memory and generational memory, I think, which now there is a growing body of research about. And so I prefer to be agnostic about it. I don't think a line is our best metaphor for time, but I don't know what's going to replace it.
I like the river.
The river is great.
Yeah, that was a great image.
Yeah.
But like, really, haven't we lived this the last couple of years in particular? It's been so crazy, right? Like, you know, how long is the pandemic? Sometimes I'm like, is it 1? Is it 2? Like, is it
2019, 2020?
I can't remember. But day to day might go so slowly, right? It's so grueling. So strange. And I see people who I haven't seen in 2 or 3 years, and I feel like I saw them yesterday. I can't remember when I saw them. So I feel like they hammered it home for me. Like, yeah,
100%.
I would be happy to have questions from the audience. Please.
Jónína, you said what the elder, you paraphrased your elder about the river.
Yeah.
And as you were saying that, it reminded me of what Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, said, which is that there is no present, because even as we think or speak about the present, it's already in the past. And I could see you standing in that river, looking at the past, but the future is actually swirling around your legs as you're doing it.
Exactly.
It's so cool. Like,
Beautiful, thank you.
I've been doing quite a bit of consideration about this time issue in the last little while. There was a woman visiting my place the other day, and she said she has a daughter, and the daughter's 6 years old. And she said, my daughter is my age. I am my mother's age. My mother is my grandmother's age. She was sort of making a almost a biological linkage kind of thing. That way. The other thing that, a few weeks ago, a woman, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about the trauma in her life and how the trauma was carried genetically in terms of the Holocaust and the disruption in her marriage. And it seemed to me that there's some meat in this. Okay? The third thing I was thinking about was I've been reading about Stalin's dispossession of people in Ukraine and the starvation in Ukraine as a result of the desire to collectivize farming and push people into industrial economies. And I started wondering, well, could the Ukrainian resistance have its roots in the dispossession by Stalin, or Stalin? Could that be carried genetically forward? I was wondering what you thought about that continuation of decline.
Okay, heavy duty stuff, Carl.
Yeah.
I'm not going to try to paraphrase that, but I think all the panelists heard it. Would anyone like to comment on the point?
The intergenerational trauma, I think that's very real. I have no doubt of that whatsoever. But I also believe in the teaching that says when we heal 7 generations forward and 7 back. So for me, that's why I think my ancestors push on me. They're tired of feeling the way they feel, and they are quieter now. So I'm healing for myself, but also for them, but then for my son, and that gives me more motivation. But the other side of that we often seem to forget is that gifts are coming forward too. So certain gifts that someone may have are passed on through that blood memory. And so, but to answer the last question you had, that's above my pay grade. I don't know how to answer that.
Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Question for Peggy, that you had to rely on research from those 3 sources that were all male sources, not really from Anna. And I know as a novelist you get to fill in. But where do you find female voices and in historical record to build upon? And do you think that we have really changed having female voices in history now and going forward?
Well, where do you think we find female voices? If you find out, let me know.
Yes.
That's really super challenging, right? And like I said at my presentation yesterday, that was one of the things that really motivated me was that, when I started doing my work, I was like, wow, what were the women doing? What were they doing? And why do we know so much about her husband and about the supercargo on board the ship, but we know like almost nothing about her? We know so little about her. So, okay, so that's really challenging. And I don't know where we find out about it. Hopefully we're going to be doing better and better at it, right? It's not to say there's nothing out there, but it's sparse compared to, the male record. And of course, then concerns are really different, right? It's just not reflective of, what half the population is doing every day. Will things get better? Maybe. Maybe. Yeah.
And that's why it has to be fiction.
Yeah.
Is it because you have to try and imagine
Her life,
Yeah.
Her life, and also, and all the women, right? What were the women doing?
Yes.
Jónína, knowing the importance of the healing 7 generations back and 7 generations forward. And there's so much resistance of family members for you to tell the stories.
Mhm.
How do you deal with the resistance, knowing how important it is? Or can you try and convince anyone?
Well, I've always been the black sheep, so it's not really a new position for me to be in one way. I'm a little bit used to it. I don't in some ways. Like in some ways I'm disconnected from some of my family because they don't agree with the way that I've lived my life. They don't, some of them are quite racist. I hate to say that about them, but it's the reality. They're Saskatchewan farmers, and so we have and Facebook just ruined everything, because we could kind of just not really know that much about each other. And damn, Facebook comes along and, oh my goodness, the things I'm posting upset them, and the things they're posting upset me, and so I had to make a decision about what felt right to me. And for whatever reason, like I say, it was pushing on me. And I really, really, really believe, like I know that I helped my father, for example. Before he died, he was going to apply for his Metis status. So at 81 years of age, having hidden his entire life, I shared the stories that I uncovered, and there were many specific stories about our family that I was able to find. He started to take pride in it. So I just went ahead anyway, whether people resisted or not. I had to. I can't explain it. It just pushed on me. And I'm so glad I did. You know, I really am, because now my niece, who's just turned 17, she really wants these stories. And so she will have them. Like, she won't have to do what I did, which was search for them. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the ancestral resonances of landscape. I find going to certain places that I've never been to before, I feel like I've been to before. And I'm wondering if you have that kind of experience and if it shows up for you in your writing.
Oh my God.